Hey everyone, with Honkai Star Rail's version 2.2 update right around the corner, I wanted to take a look back at the story and the characters we've met in Penacony so far, and I've come to the conclusion that Honkai Star Rail needs to slow down. I think they should really reconsider this whole two characters per version strategy that they're doing. Why, you might ask? This video isn't trying to argue against the pace of power creep in the game, or the fact that free-to-plays or low spenders have to skip so many banners and characters if they want to have any amount of investment in a character that they like. What I'm trying to argue here is with how often new characters are coming out, the story doesn't give them enough time and development to make us even care about a majority of these new characters. Let's break it down. By now it's pretty clear that each version update follows a similar structure: 2 new characters and 4-ish so hours of story content. For filler patches, this is not so much a problem because there's nothing pressing going on, so we can kind of take a step back and visit places that we've not gone to in a long time. But since we're in the midst of the Penacony story right now, this is where I think it starts to get murky and a little bit troublesome. My main gripe with the Penacony story and possibly future main story quests is that with so little time to progress the overarching plot, catch us up on previously introduced characters, and introduce us to these new and shiny characters as a not so obvious tactic to make us pull for them, the story's pacing suffers, and this feeling of rushness and fragmentation makes it hard to even care about a majority of these characters beyond a very simple surface level liking for their character concept. For a lot of these characters, you see their trailers, and maybe you pull for them because you like some part of their aesthetic, kit, or their playstyle, but the reality is that often as soon as their debut patch is over, their presence in the story falls off a literal cliff. It's a little disheartening and dampening then to see such interesting character concepts not be explored further, and it doesn't do much for the world building because you're basically itching and fiending for crumbs of a character or some dialogue or even some semblance of development for these characters. To kind of prove my point, let's look no further than how Black Swan and Sparkle were handled between the version 2.0 quest and the version 2.1 quest. Both of these characters had their debut banners in version 2.0 and, unsurprisingly, had a pretty sizable impact on the story. Black Swan saved us from the death meme, told us some mumbo-jumbo about the dangers of the dreamscape, and brought us to Aventurine for the end of the version 2.0 story. On the other hand, Sparkle was the one to send us to the Shadow Realm, the dreamscape, and she was working with Sunday to cover up Robin's incident, and she was also dropping hints of Aventurine packaged in these very not so subtle racist remarks. The thing is, between version 2.0 and 2.1, Black Swan and Sparkle fall off hard. It's almost jarring to see the degree of drop-off that these two have in terms of presence, exploration, and interaction. Black Swan talks to us for a little bit about the case and about Aventurine, escorts us to the hotel, and then disappears before seemingly coming into contact with Boothill through the phone call. And Sparkle was probably waddling around Penacony after sending us to the Shadow Realm until she had to show up to nudge Aventurine in the right direction for his own investigation. And I see 2 problems with this. The first is that for such hyped up and popular characters, bear in mind, Sparkle's trailer literally had the fastest growing view count in the entire game on their YouTube channel. It's incredibly disappointing then to see them get so sidelined where it feels like they got demoted to plot devices and mouthpieces to push our current star of the patch in the right direction or to introduce future characters that have yet to debut. The other problem I have with this is that even though they are technically still contributing to the story, there's still mountains of questions that their presence fails to address. Just going off rip, what relationship and interactions does Black Swan have with the family? Was it really just a coincidence that she, being in search of the most unblemished memories, would be invited to Penacony? Or was there some source or foresight that told her that something was going to happen during the festival and was then an opportunity for her to collect these memories? Or better yet, how did any of these characters like Sparkle or Acheron figure out the truth behind Penacony? What business does Sparkle and the tavern have on Penacony? And why isn't anyone, when they seem to know so much, not being shown doing anything with that information? Well, let's take a step back and think, is this really a problem? Should I be treating this as such a big deal? Well, the reality is that Honkai Star Rail so far has been doing an amazing job at character design and creating characters based on concepts that are known to be popular in the anime and gacha gaming space. It doesn't take a genius to see the similarities between Kafka and Makima from Chainsaw Man, Sparkle and Kurumi from Date A Live, and Blade and every edgelord anime protagonist on the planet. The list goes on. The problem is that when there's such an inconsistency in which characters get to have screen time and development, a lot of those great character concepts don't get explored as much as they probably should, and they effectively get shelved for the next character coming up. And I think this leads to two pretty noticeable outcomes. The first is that because they don't get fleshed out enough, our impression and memory of their traits and personality are not poignant and lasting, so when their debut patch is over and their presence dwindles, what we remember of their character, their backstory, and their motivations are often mischaracterized and oversimplified for what it probably was intended to be. For example, Argenti was introduced as a dramatic and chivalrous knight that draws a lot of inspiration from shoujo animes like Revolutionary Girl Utena. But now that we're a few patches off from his debut, how many of us genuinely care about his character, his pursuit of beauty and whatnot? Nowadays, people mostly remember him as that bro character to our protagonist, and that sometimes cringy and quirky dude that is a bit too infatuated with a plant. Likewise, Black Swan was introduced way back as a mysterious and ambivalent fortune teller that was supposedly narrating our story as it progressed, and now in Penacony, she appeared to be as helpful or selfish as her motivations wanted her to be. But even one patch after her debut banner, the only real impression and discourse we can really see about her character now is really how well she can dance the tango with Acheron. The second outcome is that I think it can really lead to cases of rushness and feeling fragmented in the story. Well, what do I mean by this? Let's take the whole Firefly storyline and the beginning parts of Penacony as an example. I personally thought that the whole ordeal with Firefly was rushed and felt forceful. The constant name drops of a date by the other characters, and the trauma dump in that scenic place with the sad music as a means to make me sympathize with her felt a little jarring when realistically, we only really spent an afternoon with her, and so much of that time was actually interacting with other parties instead of being genuine one-to-one time. Because of this, her getting stabbed by the death meme felt more like a scene for the sake of shock value than anything emotional or introducing a sense of loss. But imagine if we didn't have to spend so much time juggling between two new characters and the overarching story. Imagine if we got more than 4 hours of story content per patch. Imagine if the story didn't have to finish in 3 patches and we actually let it develop over the course of 4 or 5 patches. Then maybe the Firefly plotline could have probably played out a little something like this. We go through business as usual. We have our afternoon date with her and have our run-in with the death meme and Black Swan, but instead of jumping straight back into the dreamscape to witness her death, we run into her again somehow. We build up some more of that rapport and that connection. Maybe she helps us solve puzzles, or she assists us in battle with some kind of temporary boost. This is obviously one of the many possibilities, but this would really let the story breathe and show us how helpful Firefly is to our investigation and our experiences with the world and the content, as well as maybe clue us into our past with her and the rest of the Stellaron hunters and make our bond and affection for her feel more natural. By making her feel more like a present part of the different facets of our experience in Penacony, you'll feel a lot more emotionally compelling when they finally do decide to have her stabbed by the death meme and give us that genuine sense of loss. And with how the story has to dedicate so much time to focus on specific characters and make us warm up to them and consider pulling for them, it also means that factions and characters in the background and what they're up to feels like it's completely slowed to a halt. After finishing 2.1, there's still so much muddiness and confusion over what Jade and Topaz are up to in the real world, whether the Annihilation Gang are even planning to return to Penacony, and like I mentioned before, what Sparkle is even trying to achieve on Penacony. I compare this to shows like early Game of Thrones, where they really excelled at giving different factions and characters time to shine and make us feel engaged in their motives and schemes. Whereas shows like Game of Thrones leave every scene with excitement and tension on how these schemes will now intertwine and interconnect with each other, the schemes that Honkai Star Rail drops and hints at aren't given enough time to linger and marinate in our heads, so they feel mostly out of left field. I've talked extensively about why these things are potentially an issue, but it wouldn't sit right with me to leave this without any suggestions. Firstly, they could definitely do more character stories and companion quests, give us more reasons to care about them outside of their cameos in the main story quest. Secondly, they could extend the main story quest from 3 patches to maybe 4 or 5 patches before we enter the epilogue. Thirdly, they could add even more content per story patch and then add a skip button for those who don't want to have to sit through even more of the story. The ultimate goal here is to let the story breathe more and give some characters more time to shine and flex their personalities and their motives. These are just some of my thoughts and frustrations about the breakneck pace that Honkai Star Rail has been releasing new characters and how they fit into the world and story we're experiencing patch to patch. I say all this because the culture of these gacha games is to make you pull for characters you like. You probably shouldn't pull for meta because they're more than likely to be power creep down the line, so people often tell you to pull based on some element of their aesthetic, personality, or story that speaks to you. But for me personally, if they get such inconsistent screen time and development that they can barely stand on their own 2 feet as a character, then it feels like I'm not really pulling for their story or personality, but instead some surface level desire for their aesthetic, which I feel like is such a waste and disappointment for how well researched and well crafted these character concepts and designs are. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end of this one. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Am I being stuck up with how I view these characters? Am I being too crazy for expecting too much out of these gacha games? And maybe let me know what you think about balancing story and gameplay when you consider a character to roll for. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you all in the next one.